I know I have a difficult task today following up the governor of the Bank of England. I'm sure you'll agree that he did a fantastic speech, and it was very informative. But it leaves me with a difficult task because I have to somehow match that, and I hope I'll match it in originality because we knew the basic principles of what went on yesterday. And I want to explain why I'm doing Joseph Schumpeter. And there are two reasons for this. One is because I think we focus a lot on the big economists. We focus a lot on the atomistic style of Adam Smith. We focus a lot on Marx. Schumpeter is a Marxist scholar. He deviates from the normal path. And this is when I think we have to look more closely. We need to scrutinise the big economists. Because they obviously get good ideas. And Marx sees a very good underlying current of capitalism. He sees the teleology, which is the life scale. It's how it progresses when it moves from capitalism to socialism to communism, and then later on to Marxism. So he gets a good underlying trend. But as Kingsley said in his first lecture, surplus value, that's one of the key theories around labour. That is false now. The maths have been proved to be false, and lots of his maths have been proved to be false. So when Marxist scholars like Schumpeter come up, and they produce excellent books like this one, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, which we're going to be studying later on, that's important to study now. Now, despite what I've just said, I am going to start with Keynes. And it's because it leads nicely into Schumpeter. And in 1930, Keynes thought up a little jaunt into the future, a little excursion, and it was called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Now that's slightly ironic because Keynes didn't actually have any grandchildren, but it was even more strange because Keynes didn't often go into the future. He was very concerned with the day-to-day running of the economy. 1930, you'll notice, is the interwar years. It's just before Keynes becomes a bit infatuated with inflation, unemployment, rebuilding the world economy, the IMF in 1944. And the basic premise of this book is that by the year 2030, the economic problem will be solved. Needless to say, this book wasn't taken very seriously, because that's the age-old problem of economics, not enough to go around. And Keynes thought that by 2030, with a few more generations, the problem would be not allocating the too little, but allocating the too much. It's sort of a Malthusian problem in reverse. We find that actually there's too much. And that's particularly pertinent today. I think on Sunday, the world population peaked at 7 billion. And so far we haven't seen, this dreadful debacle that Malthus predicted. Keynes thought that, a man the American man at the time of the Civil War could produce 5 times less than a man in 1930s America. That wasn't because a man of the 1930s America was some sort of, Kantian Ubermensch, this Superman by himself. It was because he had a technological capability that he yielded that was far higher than the man in the Civil War. He thought that every generation attacked the economic problem with its own energies, and each generation subsequently meant that more and more was produced relative to the population. Secondly, he lived in England at the time, 40 million English people. They didn't necessarily consider themselves benefactors of bountiful providence, but they certainly had better living standards than the people in 1900 had, 1800, and definitely 1700. So there was this upward trend, and I can see Robert sort of twisting his face, contorting his face, which isn't something he does often, and it's because we're discussing at the moment in economics living standards and its relationship to GDP and then to national utility. I'm sure he'll pick me up on that later. But by the way, if you have any questions, just jump in at any time. So the ramifications of this, that the economic problem we solve. Firstly, it will relegate economics to the history books. And secondly, I want to sort of address this year 2030. This is the first time I know of that I was directly confronted with my own future. With our generation, it's definitely our children's generations. And Joseph Schumpeter talks to us with a voice that's remarkably contemporary. And again, let me go back to this thing I said about Marx. He gets the good idea, he gets the underlying teleology of capitalism, but it needs to be updated. It's no longer applicable. Das Kapital, all 2,500 pages of it, are not applicable to the 20th century, to the 21st century. and Schumpeter updates it. Now I'm going to give a short description of his life because I think it would be cursory to just sort of waltz straight into his theories without having contextualised him. Also, later on in the lecture, you'll see how his life and his upbringing sort of interlink with his theories. He was born in Austria in 1883. Notice that that's the same year that Keynes was born. It was also the same year that Marx died. Both of these men influenced him profoundly. You'll see how later on. He went to the Theresianum, which is a very posh boarding school in Austria. He was born into well-bred stock, as the 1850s Englishmen would say. His father died tragically 4 months after his birth, but his mother remarried to a distinguished general. In the Theresianum, he developed a lot of airs and graces that made him actually rather unpopular as a figure. He soon lost them, became far less highfalutin. But he used to waltz into class and say stuff like, "Well, I have 3 wishes. One is to be a great horseman, a great economist, and a great lover. But alas, I can only achieve 2 of the 3. I'll leave that to your imagination." He went in between. He helped out the German industry. I mean, obviously, in the interwar years, it was a bit difficult. He went to Egypt, where he wrote another famous book, which is called The Theory of Economic Development, which we'll do in a second. He went to Japan. He went to England, and whilst in England, he married. A year after marriage, again, but his wife died in childbirth. And then out of escapism, more than anything, he went to America. And in America, he got a professorship at Harvard. And he soon became a campus figure. And Robert Harbronner recalls in his book, The Worldly Philosophers, who's read it? It's ironically about plumbers. Have you read it?
No.
Oh, well, it's a fantastic book. It's a great introductory economic text, and I based this lecture on the part about Schumpeter. And he waltzed in and said, "Gentlemen, you are worried about the depression. You should not be. For capitalism, a depression is a good, cold douche." Now, douche isn't the contemporary meaning of the word, but for all these Keynesianists in this room who were in the depths of the 1930s depression, that was incredibly controversial to walk in and actually suggest that a depression could be a good thing for capitalism, that it actually moderates it, and that has become a predominant view. So that's something that Schumpeter coined just to start off with. If you don't know, I'm going to sketch over Keynes' view because we're going to encompass it later. Keynes thought that capitalism was intrinsically linked with stagflation, which Kingsley mentioned in the second lecture last year, which is a mixture of stagnation and inflation, so no growth whilst inflation's going on. It relied on consistent government support. Schumpeter, on the other hand, thought that capitalism is intrinsically dynamic, and we'll look at this model in a second, and growth-orientated, but he did concede that government could alleviate social distress in times of depression. Now we're going to move on to this book here, and I'm sorry, it's not actually that pixelated, and it's called The Theory of Economic Development, and Schumpeter wrote it whilst he was in Egypt. He was working for an Egyptian princess, and whilst he was there, he cut in half her rent, but doubled her profits. So needless to say, she was very happy. This is by far his greater achievement whilst in Egypt. And this book is about the way that capitalism has the propensity for growth, but that is, it's naturally inclined by the mechanics of capitalism towards growth. And I'm going to explain it to you, and this will link into the theory of entrepreneurs that Schumpeter comes out with later. So we're going to start with a static economy. This is what we see in the A-level textbooks. So we have factor of production, factor payments, consumer expenditure, and goods and services, all between firms and households. This is a static economy, there's no growth whatsoever. It's an economy without capital accumulation, most importantly. You can't accumulate capital in this, because those arrows have to contain the same amount of money. When I say static, I mean that all that stuff about injections and withdrawals we learn about, none of that happens, totally routine. Now, some of you who are applying for economics to university, and especially the ones who came here, I can see 3 in here, you should know that Mill and Ricardo come up with exactly the same method for trying to see how growth is inherent in an economy. The difference is that Schumpeter says this is the beginning of capitalism. This is how capitalism begins. Mill and David Ricardo use this model later on in their analysis. It's further down the teleology of capitalism. So this must be focused on inertia. So if there's nothing going in and out, these must, the supply of money must just circulate by itself. And inertia, that means once you push something, it keeps going. It's a bit like momentum. And Schumpeter attributes this to routine. Once you find a good way of making money, essentially, you stick to that course. The most important thing about this is that it removes all earnings that exceed the value of somebody's contribution to output. Competition, mainly, forces employers to give their employees or the workers the full value of the product they create. More surprisingly, landowners get no more than the value of their land over time. And more surprisingly still, capitalists only get the wage that their style of management and the skill as managers only as much as they deserve, basically. So we find a curious situation, because what is capitalism about? You ask your average person on the street what economics is about, and they come up with money. Now I don't have the nerve to sell on the street. It's about what is economics again? I've forgotten. The allocation of scarce resources. Thank you very much. I am qualified to give this lecture, just in case you were wondering. I don't have the nerve to say that. But capitalism is all about profit. And if there's no surplus in there, where do profits come from? Now, profits, are something that have been quibbled over for a while in economics, a very long while. Marx and Smith were very alike in their perception of profit. Kingsley mentioned surplus value, although the math has been proved wrong, it's still a legitimate explanation of where profits come from. It was basically profits are a deduction from the actual value created by labour. So, put very simply, you pay your workers less and you can take the difference from the sale of the profits. John Stuart Mill suggested that profits were a reward for the abstinence, and I quote, abstinence of capitalists. Now, I don't quite follow that. I don't know why capitalists should be rewarded for an activity that's clearly in their own interest, as it were. But Schumpeter shows us that profits appear in this static routine, inertia-based economy, when these arrows don't follow their routinized course. And so there must be a disruption to this course, and Schumpeter puts the disruption down to innovation. The word innovation implies an innovator. And it's here that Schumpeter coins a term from the old economic lexicon, the entrepreneur. Now, I'm not mainly interested in economics, I'm more interested in language, and you can imagine my delight when I heard the word entrepreneur. It's literally in French. Anyone do French here?
Yeah.
Anyone do French? Oh, well, it literally means between takers, entrepreneur. And, the point about this entrepreneur, we'll go into the functions, is that he's a profit generator. He doesn't receive the profits for coming up with these big ideas. Neither is it a profession. You can't train to be an entrepreneur. You can't go to Canterbury College and say, well, I'm not going to do level 3 bricklaying, I'm going to do entrepreneurship. And in the same way, it's not hereditary. So you're not born into this class of entrepreneurs. It's not like the bourgeoisie or the proletariat. You're born into any sort of class, and you have that. However good genetic engineering is, you can't insert a gene in somebody to say they're an entrepreneur. And actually, he paints it as a thankless task being as an entrepreneur. As we read this, we should understand, therefore, that we do not observe the emergence of all those effective traits of an entrepreneur, which are the glory of other types of social leadership. When he writes social leadership, what he means is that an entrepreneur is a type of economic leader. Just in a feudal society, a general might be a leader. In a purely free market capitalist economy, the governor of the Bank of England might be considered a leader too. Add to this the precariousness of the economic position, both of the individual entrepreneur and of the group. That refers to him being the profit generator, not the receiver. The capitalist receives the money. And the fact that when his economic success raises him up socially, he has no cultural tradition or attitude to fall back on, but moves about in society as an upstart. Upstart is an incredibly interesting word here. It reflects on the classlessness of an entrepreneur. He doesn't have to be part of a class. But actually, Schumpeter suggests that his occupation, once he becomes the entrepreneur, lifts him up into the bourgeoisie, and he doesn't totally belong. Whose ways are readily laughed at, and we shall understand why this type has never been popular. On the next slide, I'm going to show you why after painting this dismal picture of why ever would you want to become an entrepreneur. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you the reason that Schumpeter puts forward, and it's my favourite passage in economics, for which I will show you why. First, there is the dream and the will to found a private kingdom. Then there is the will to conquer, the impulse to fight, to prove oneself superior to others, to succeed for the sake, and also the fruits of success, but of success itself. Finally, there is the joy of creating, of getting things done, or simply of exercising one's energy and imagination. Just look at those last three words there, energy and imagination. Where else in an economics textbook, when describing economic theory, do you see words as subjective as energy and imagination? This is a whole new thing because it implies capitalism doesn't rest on money, on the dough created, but actually on these people here. These classless, non-hereditary, professional beings, entrepreneurs, who use their energy and imagination. Economics, you see it, it's the most, ostensibly it's the most trite, banal, dry, mathematical subject you can get. But actually it's when you start analysing these theories here, the way we're educated, how many people who learn economics in different schools will actually think when they draw a demand curve that that's the behaviour of a consumer? Economics is about individuals, and it's also about, and it's objective, but these are two things that are totally subjective: energy and imagination. We see the same thing in Keynes' explanation or use of the word animal spirits, sort of bringing Darwinian theory, the human impulse. It's shaking. Most probably, this is the passage that Keynes uses for animal spirits. Who's read this already, by the way, in the actual text? No. Most probably, of our decisions to do something positive, the full consequence of which will be drawn out over many days to come, can only be taken as the result of animal spirit, a spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction, and not as the outcome of a weighted average of quantitative benefits multiplied by quantitative probabilities. So, looked at superficially, that just means that actually you need that impulse in capitalism. It's not, complicated risk. What are we going on to now? After the theory of economic development, we move on to business cycles. Now, in between writing them, in between Egypt and America, Schumpeter joins a commission on German nationalisation of industry. Now, those who do in history will know that actually it's a bit of a pointless task trying to save the German economy in that time. It was a juggernaut hurtling towards catastrophe. Schumpeter was pacing against this. When somebody asked him why he was doing it, he said, he quipped famously, if somebody wants to commit suicide, it's a good thing if a doctor is present. And as I said, after that, the German economy collapsed. He went to Harvard. He wrote this massive two-volumed, 2,000-page spiel on business cycles. This is who has not heard of a business cycle? I know you can put your hand up this way. No. Oh, right. well that's a business cycle there. And GDP is on one, where economic activity and time on the other axis. And, this is the 1930s depression we're talking about in America, one of the most serious ever. Perhaps not as serious today, we can ask Mervyn King about that. Now, Keynes, let's describe some business cycles. Matt did business cycles last year, I think in the 4th lecture or something. Now, jugular cycles, what are jugular cycles, Matt?
Oh, that's a long time ago.
Well, I can illuminate. They're 7 to 11 year fixed cycles. So in these 7 to 11 year fixed cycles, you can observe oscillations of investment into fixed capital. So not just buying capital equipment, but also changes in the level of employment of fixed capital. So how much of it is stationary and how much is actually working. The kitchen cycles, these are short cycles of 40 months. These are mainly due to time lags in information movement affecting the decision-making of firms. Anyway, wave theory is not very well known, but it's quite prevalent to this, is the theory that predicting the future of the market is in fact possible. Now, anybody who's not a stockbroker or a banker finds it pretty difficult to read market movements. We may all think that we're terribly clever looking on the BBC website every day at the market data and thinking, oh well, Vodafone's up, that's got to be good. But actually, we know nothing. And credit and debt cycles, that's just another way to think of it. If we go back to this, this is the period here when credit is plentiful, this is when debt is plentiful, and obviously vice versa. So if we move back to business cycles. Keynes said that we're considering Keynes to be the bête noire of Schumpeter's policy. They didn't like each other very much. Schumpeter was a bit jealous of all the attention that Keynes got, I think. But Keynes said that depressions relied on the expectation of investors. Now, in Keynesian theory, the expectation of investors must be equal to the expectation of consumers, because obviously quantity bought must equal quantity produced at the end of the day. Schumpeter relied on innovators. He had to come up with a reason as to exactly why innovators weren't coming out on time. Why wasn't this working? He had to apply this theory of entrepreneurship to a business cycle at the end of the day. And the premise was that although leadership itself is difficult, you remember social leadership that we talked about? The idea that an entrepreneur is a sort of leader. Followship is easy. So once a product or a line of products have been introduced into a market, a swarm, the word is Schumpeter's, not mine, will follow. These imitators follow. The original improvement, that is the innovation, is promulgated, it's disseminated, and leads to borrowing and investment, which supplies a boom. So actually, we know that this is investment and borrowing, but until now, we've just put it down to increased spending. Schumpeter gives it a reason. He gives it a subjective, believable, cogent reason. We reach the top, competition takes over, profits disappear, routine, incredibly important word, I mentioned it at the beginning. The routine, going back to finding good ways of money, takes over, profits disappear, activity dies down, we're in the trough again. Now, we return to the grim years of the 1930s, and the slides I showed you, the jugular cycles and the kitchen cycles. Schumpeter explained it. He thought there were 3 business cycles, in effect. He thought that there was one of 40 months, which is the kitchen cycle, one of 7 to 11 years, the jugular cycle, and this is where Schumpeter comes up with his, entrepreneur-based prediction, which is that there's a 50-year pulse, which comes about with the introduction of new technology. That is, the important ones would be steam locomotion, the aeroplane, some types of machinery, etc. He thought that they were all touching the bottom at the same time. So a combination of these two, they were all touching the bottom. And that had meant that the severity of the recession was especially bad. He also thought that there were negative external reasons, bad government policy, the Russian Revolution were amongst them. But this isn't why we remember business cycles. Although it's illuminating, he did have trouble proving all of this stuff, that a swarm of investors would follow, a swarm of imitators would follow. We remember this book because it implies that capitalism doesn't rest on money. We came to study it relies on more subjective things, like energy and imagination and animal spirits. And we come to this word, faith. It's incredibly important because the book implies in another section that to keep capitalism going, there needs to be a faith in the values, the virtues, and the conditions of the society that capitalism produces. Capitalist society is just a society that uses capitalism as its economic base. It doesn't necessarily need to have conforming political chambers, but people need to have faith in the society that capitalism creates to keep it going. And Schumpeter thought that just wasn't happening. People were losing faith with it. And that was despite its so-called economic success. And then we move on to his Schumpeter's theory of the future of capitalism and the introduction of socialism. Because in the end, he is a Marxist. He does take up Marx's ideas. It's in this book here. It's a brilliant book. It's a bit hard to trawl through some parts, but it does have passages of sheer brilliance. And as I said, focuses on the future of capitalism. Capitalism, it starts with 4 chapters. Marx the teacher, Marx the sociologist, Marx the economist, and Marx the teacher. Now, perhaps it might be, do I repeat one there?
Teacher. Yeah, you said Marx teacher.
Marx the prophet, I do apologise. Because I saw Colby contort his face again and wondered, what is it? Perhaps it's already clear where they're going to agree and disagree. For those of you who don't know, capitalism for Marx is sort of, capitalism firstly is the total private ownership of the factors of production, which are land, labour, capital, and entrepreneurship itself. For Marx, capitalism is this friction, is the dynamism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the age-old battle between the working class and the owning class. Philosophically, it's dialectical materialism. Dialectical meaning progress or change through conflict. Materialism meaning something slightly more complicated that isn't directly relevant. But if we look at it, that was supposed to be whilst I was describing Marx. But we turn the page after Marx the teacher and we see this sentence. Can capitalism survive? No, I do not think it can. But it can't be for the reasons that Marx put forward, because otherwise, there wouldn't be any point writing the book. We might have just published Das Kapital again. And the reason Schumpeter gives for capitalism not failing on the basis of Marx's predictions and prognostications is creative destruction. Just out of interest, who's heard of creative destruction? Oh, great. Now, this is the passage that describes creative destruction in the book. Creative destruction incessantly revolutionises the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one. This process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. Now, to me, essential fact implies that it's inherent in capitalism to incessantly destroy the old capitalism whilst incessantly creating a new one. Now, if that is the mechanics of capitalism, it doesn't fail mechanically, because there's nothing about this being disproportional. It doesn't destroy more than it creates. I've got a clip later on, which I'm not sure will work, because I'm not sure this has internet, but it's a clip of Alan Greenspan talking about creative destruction. And the practical application of something like this is that capitalism might destroy a few jobs in a business cycle, but it will always create them somewhere else. That's the practical application of this theory. But the point to remember is that capitalism doesn't fail mechanically. It doesn't fail as a result of itself. Now here we come to the Schumpeterian contradiction, which is that historically, that's just the same one as before. We come to a Schumpeterian contradiction, which is that although capitalism is a historic and economic success, it isn't a sociological one. And a very famous sociologist called Edmund Burke, in fact he was the founder, I believe probably, of sociology, because I read it in a book that you lent to me, so I assume you read it. So it's not a sociological success. And Schumpeter contends that it's the mentality of capitalism that eventually brings it down. But by mentality I mean its critical nature, its rational nature. That permeates the system, as it were. This whole mentality is better explained by this passage here. Capitalism creates a critical frame of mind which, after having destroyed the moral authority of so many other institutions, in the end turns against its own. The bourgeois finds his amazement that the rationalist attitude does not stop at the credentials of kings and popes, but goes on to attack private property and the whole scheme of bourgeois values. I need to emphasise here that capitalism doesn't fail in the Marxist sense of it being unable to weather a worsening succession of crises, or a big revolution with the working class. It's simply because the atmosphere has changed, and that to me seems much more plausible, in fact, than a whole general population rising up and overthrowing its oppressors. Now, it happened in Cuba. Cuba's a slightly exceptional circumstance because it's an island, relatively small population, and it had been held by a dictator for a long time. Russia, the Russian Revolution in 1917, Schumpeter was a bit critical of whether that was actually a revolution. Those of you who study political theory amongst you will know that there's an ongoing debate since the State and Revolution was published in 1916 by Lenin. There's a big discussion about whether a revolution can be led by the intelligentsia. Schumpeter thinks that it can't because he thinks that the intelligentsia are a class apart from the proletariat, and therefore they're not interested. They're simply interested in opposition and not supporting the proletariat. Now let me explain that in another slide. So this is him starting to introduce the concept of socialism. Usually after capitalism, socialism sort of infiltrates. I use the word infiltrates because it has negative connotations, and I'm not quite sure about socialism. While things are going well at the surface, there is a tendency towards another civilization that slowly works deep down below. Now that's obvious enough what that means. The other civilization is socialism. But deep down below, I'd like to investigate that phrase because people have hazarded guesses as to where exactly the idea of socialism comes from. And whatever people say, Marx didn't invent socialism, he didn't invent communism, it was around far longer before, and he invented Marxism, hence the name of the ideology. But it has been shown that actually, in parochial times, in ancient eras, socialism has worked. Because in an economy that's far less complex, where far fewer economic transactions take place every day, with far fewer people, it can be a better way of allocating resources. I personally think it's been shown that socialism cannot work in a state any larger than the Vatican City, because it cannot encompass it can't guarantee the effective allocation of scarce resources. Once more we turn the page. Can socialism work? Of course it can. Now, this is where he introduces his form of socialism, and I'm inclined to say that it's a planned economy, it's bureaucratic, it's very benign. Those of you who were here last year will know James Manning. He was constantly going on about giving the poor tokens. That's exactly what Schumpeter thinks, that that's how you should try and equalise society. It's the age-old French égalité, fraternité and liberté. There's an interesting thing that Schumpeter says about inflation. Obviously, when you make the transition from capitalism to socialism, you need to abolish money. And Schumpeter's proposition was to effectively deliberately induce inflation so as to destroy the monetary system. I wonder if I made one too many jokes about or spoke more than 300 words about socialism. But the basic thing to remember is that it's a benign, bureaucratic, planned economy. Kingsley.
But how would you respond to the idea that these sort of descriptions of states, from capitalist state to socialist state,
yes.
There is no such thing, I believe, as a capitalist state or a socialist state. Once we start using those, because no structure of society has an infinite horizon. So if you say a country is capitalist, no country can have a structured society forever. So what I'm trying to understand is that you can't say that capitalism will end because no state is completely capitalist. Because for us right now, the protests in St. Paul's, they're fighting against a capitalist state, but our state is not a capitalist state in its entirety. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying, and I accept it. It's a very good point. One of the criticisms of, this is going to be a roundabout way of explaining my point of view, but one of the criticisms of Marxism is that it's idealist, and that you want something that isn't directly attainable, and that you're likely to be disappointed. And the point is that, isn't it idealist to be a capitalist? Because a capitalist invariably believes, to be a full capitalist, that all the factors of production are under private ownership. The only economy that comes close to that in the world is the US, with 75%. So the point I would make is that you don't... I agree with you. One thing doesn't end and another starts. It's a seamless transition.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's just the it's just the socialisation of production and the nationalisation of industry that we're meaning here. And then you get caught up with the problems of idealism, as I said, and realism.
And what I would like to emphasise is just it never stops moving. That's the point. It's just that you're not saying you're completely moving from capitalist to social. Well, you can say that, but it's just that whole transition is never moving. And what keeps it going is sort of people people not happy with. No one can ever be
Yes.
happy with a
You
structured
can't
society.
ever make everybody happy.
Yeah.
And this is another criticism I have of communism, because to try and implement something so radically different, how many people in this room are communists? If there was a communist revolution today, what percentage of the UK would be remotely happy with that? Even in countries like Cuba, where there was a communist resolution, it was just a few, 3 power-crazy individuals, trying to run quite a small economy. So you are right that it is a seamless transition. One thing doesn't end and another simultaneously starts. Right. Wider implications of entrepreneurship. The West-East transition, and I mentioned this in the question to Mervyn King that I posed yesterday. We're seeing today, and for the last, I think, 20 years, I read an article because Rushworth loves The Economist, and I said to him that it's not very good, and so did Professor Richard Sackwer, but he still doesn't accept it. And I went to The Economist website, and it said that the 20th century was definitely, without doubt, a century for America. Yeah, fair enough, for the first 80 years of it. The last, say, 20 years, power, economic power, political power has been shifting slowly east. That's my contention. Now, the situation we face today is that within 20 years' time, China will be churning out of its universities a third of Britain's population every year. And actually, their degrees will be useful. It won't be equestrian studies from Loughborough. I apologise to any people who applied to Loughborough to study equestrian studies. But this is the thing we're seeing. People are being trained. The chinks are constantly stealing German technology. You see it, Siemens set up a factory in China, and
edit that out.
Yeah. Sorry, is that un-PC?
It's Chinese, it's fine.
Yeah, I do apologise. The Oriental populace of the People's Republic of China. They're always stealing German technological ideas. Siemens set up a factory in Pyongyang, which is a city with 70 million free labourers. So essentially, that means that the price for labour is essentially about 0. The Chinese government said, let's go and have a look. We need to check that your factory conforms to safety regulations, which of course, with the amount of sweatshops in China, they're terribly worried about. And they went in and they copied the machinery, and now they're producing bullet trains, one of which crashed, I remember, but they're producing bullet trains that Siemens that Siemens originally conceived. Entrepreneurship, just to link it back, China, that's going to be the future. It's always been the future. Coming up with new products, coming up with new ways to do things. That's where the money's going to be. And the countries that find themselves best, or best at doing that, will invariably be on the top of the world economy. Now, the next slide has a link on it. I'm not sure it'll work, but it's about creative destruction. This idea of permanently destroying, the idea that Alan Greenspan comes up with, of causing unemployment, but creating employment elsewhere. That's where the idea of frictional unemployment comes from. That people are constantly moving between jobs. You can never hope for 100% employment. Inflation and growth the same. Let me see if this.
We in this country have embraced globalization over the decades very much to our benefit. The world trading system has expanded dramatically, world standards of living have expanded dramatically, and it is we in the United States who have benefited the most. We recognize, however, that the very nature of globalization, which creates ever higher standards of living, also is a process which we call creative destruction. The problem with creative destruction is that it is destruction. And there is a very considerable amount of turmoil that goes on in the process. As I've mentioned here many times, we hire and essentially let go 1 million workers a week in this country. It's a huge churning turnover. And I think what we must focus on is, as we gain the benefits of globalization, it's important that we address the problems that those who are on the destruction side of the globalization problem are addressed.
So that's the way that Schumpeter's theories can apply to the modern day economy. That's what I meant at the start of the lecture when I said it contemporizes theories, it makes them modern again. Investigating Marx and Keynes and Adam Smith is incredibly interesting because it gives us indicators of how the economy used to work and how ours works. But I think it's all the more important to analyse people like Schumpeter, people like Antonio Gramsci, who was a Marxist revolutionary in Italy under Mussolini's fascism, who has some very important ideas, because they show us ideas that are more relevant to us. And that's all I have to say. I'd be very happy to answer any questions, but thank you very much for turning up. Yes.
Why would you say that Schumpeter isn't as popular as the other guys? Why would you say?
Because, firstly, because the ideas he was voicing were controversial. Secondly, because Keynes did have a lot of publicity, and Keynes was the engineer of modern society, or modern economic society as British people know it. And Schumpeter didn't write prolifically. He's written perhaps 3 influential works, whereas Keynes has probably written over 20 pamphlets, tracts and books. And obviously Schumpeter was building on the idea of Marx. Marx was an absolutely prolific writer. 2,500 pages of Das Kapital, 4 volumes, one of which had to be published posthumously. Adam Smith, I'll give £10 to anybody who's read the entire Wealth of Nations.
We try.
Try. Pages. But he wasn't commenting on everything equally. It's not just that he didn't write a lot, he didn't want to write a lot. He didn't comment on a lot of issues, but because he was very interested and focused on the future of capitalism and the mechanics of capitalism.
So another thing is, why do you think the economists now aren't dealing with political theory? Because much of this, and much of what Keynes dealt with, and much of what the big economists before dealt with was political theory. Why do you think that now?
Well, I think,
science.
I think, is it 200? Alfred Marshall very much took economics as a subject and moved it away from political economy. How long ago was that?
1891 he wrote Principles of Economics.
Yes.
So even after Marshall, obviously the economy was dealing with political theory. But yeah, I see what you're saying about.
Yeah. So we have moved away from considering them to be the same discipline, as it were. But there is a fair area of overlap with the 2 subjects. And if you look at it, capitalism is not only an economic theory, the same as socialism, it's political as well. There is a philosophy behind it. You just need to read Harry Winter Taylor's article on the website to know that economics has a philosophy, it has a mentality, as Schumpeter rightly points out. So by considering capitalism, by considering creative destruction and monopolistic practices, which is another chapter in there, Schumpeter concurrently